connecting our lives to help us survive. So we live our time to the fullest we can.
Hello, welcome to Professional Insights created by Dementia Action Alliance. I'm proud to be your host, Barney Nelson. During our Professional Insights podcast, we have educational conversations with professionals in the dementia community to provide answers and support to people living with dementia and care partners. My guest today is Dr. John Fitzgerald. Happy to say that. Dr. Fitzgerald is on clinical faculty in the Department of Psychiatry at Oregon Health and Sciences University, a licensed professional counselor in Oregon, and a certified addiction specialist. He holds a doctoral degree in system science and social psychology from the System Science Graduate Program at Portland State University, where he also holds an adjunct faculty position. He routinely speaks on topics related to behavioral health and makes available monthly webinars for free at 5actionswebinars.com. So again, John, welcome to our Professional Insights today, and we're looking forward to what you have to say.
Thanks, Barney. Glad
Now,
to
we're
be
going to
here.
be talking about grief, as you all are aware today. John has spent a lot of time in this space working with people on that. So John, let's start off with talking about grief and kind of setting the table, if you will. A lot of people don't necessarily know the ins and outs completely of grief. So why don't you talk a little bit about what is the nature of grief and why is it important for people day-to-day living?
Sure. First, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk about this topic. It's one that for most of my life, I really did not embrace and understand very well. And it kind of hit me like often it does for people in a pretty hard way. In 2016, I lost my mother. And it was unexpected. She had stage 4 lung cancer. And when I talked to the doctor, he said she's got about 3 months to live, and true to his word, she died about 3 months later. I was really grateful that I was with her when she took her last breath. I was holding her hand. And the next day I had some meetings that I hadn't changed. And I remember driving to one of the meetings thinking, I'm going to go in and I'm going to tell them that I lost my mom last night. And when I walked into that meeting, everybody was already talking and chatting and engaged, and it just didn't feel right. And by the time the meeting was up, I realized, okay, I'm not going to say anything. And I walked out of that meeting really upset with myself and angry that something so important as the loss of my mother, I wasn't able to put into words or to say anything. Now, one of the benefits of being a therapist is that I have a lot of friends that are therapists. So one of them sent me an article that was titled The Geography of Sorrow. And it was an interview by Francis Weller, who's a grief therapist. And when I read the article, I realized I wasn't alone, that my inability to really know what to do with loss around my mom and to appreciate the nature of grief was something that other people struggled. So the article opened me up first to the idea that I really needed to start learning more about the nature of grief. Like many, most people, we did a 2-hour celebration of life. But it just wasn't enough. It didn't feel like that it honored who my mom was. And so after I read the article, I read Francis Weller's book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, which I recommend everybody read. And I got a hold of him and shared with him a bit about my, sort of lack of understanding of grief, and asked whether he would come to Portland and do a workshop. And he had already been talking to some other colleagues. And so he did come to Portland. And in May of 2017, we did a 2.5-day grief workshop, which really, again, opened me to this topic. One of the things that he says in the book that I just want to read, and I think is really kind of gets at the essence of what is grief, is he says, no one escapes suffering in this life. None of us is exempt from loss, pain, illness, and death. How is it that we have so little understanding of these essential experiences? How is it that we have attempted to keep grief separated from our lives and only begrudgingly acknowledge its presence at the most obvious of times, such as at a funeral? So, in some ways, I think going through that workshop opened me up again to this idea that grief in many ways is the essence of life. A number of years ago, I was at a monastery and I was walking around. I ran into a monk. He was one of the senior monks, and we started chatting. And I half jokingly asked him, I said, I'm not going to be a monk in my life, but given that you've, spent your whole life doing this, can you break it all down to me, like in a Cliff Notes version of what you've learned? Can you maybe give it to me in one word? And he really chuckled a bit and probably was thinking to himself, okay, this is the new generation wanting everything quick. But he said, I can do that for you. And I said, all right. He said, you ready for your one word? I said, yeah. He said, your word is impermanence. And at the time, I heard the word, but I didn't really understand and experience that, because in some ways that is the essence of life. Everything is constantly changing. We don't experience that way because time moves so slowly. So we end up by living this illusion that things are more permanent than they really are. And like Buddhists talk about attachment, we attach to things, we attach to our life, we attach to experiences, to people. And then when those attachments go away, because everything we love, we're going to lose. That's one of the things that Francis Weller talks about in his book. We experience loss, we get a bit of a hit. So, this is an incredibly important topic because, again, it gets us down to the essence of what is life all about. Now, I will say last month, I had two very, very significant losses in my life. One of my mentors, both academic, clinically, and spiritually, a man named Dr. Dan Brown, passed early in April. And then a really close colleague of mine and friend, Matt Moderson, also passed a little bit on April 17th, on Easter. So even right now, I'm deeply feeling those losses and experiencing this topic.
And the reality is that going through a grieving process is very different in a lot of cultures around the world. Is that not correct?
It is in some ways.
We kind of tend to have a funeral service, but there's other cultures that are much more elaborate. Correct?
Absolutely. I think in some ways that's been part of the learning process for me over these last number of years that I've been introduced to his work, is that other cultures have appreciated the important role of grief, and they've made room for it in society. They have realized that grief has always been communal, that it's something that needs to be seen, and it's something that we need support. We're all, it's what connects all of us. We all experience loss. It's something that connects all of us. And yet, in many ways, we go through it privately. We go to a funeral, and again, a couple hours, but I've had a number of clients that I've taken on that, a few months later are saying, what's wrong with me? I'm so sad. I can't get out of bed. I'm depressed.
Oh.
Grief has no timetable.
Yeah.
And yet we are living in a culture that wants us to just go to work the next day and move right along. And yet that's not the way that works.
No. A lot of people that are watching are people living with dementia right now. So let's kind of get this drilled down a little more specifically around dementia. And, how do you describe the relationship of grief to dementia, John? What are some of the thoughts that you have on that space?
Yeah. So one of the things that I really appreciated in Francis Weller's book was he created these 5 gates of grief, or different types of grief that we experience in our life. One of the first is that everything we love, we're going to lose. And that's kind of just the nature that, people die. But as I read through the different gates and his work, one of the things that I didn't encounter much of was just the loss of our own function in our body, the loss of what happens in the sense that we develop kind of who we are based on the senses that come into our life through the world and how our bodies work. And yet in some ways, I think, and again, I'm not an expert on dementia, but part of our process of going through life is that our bodies are constantly changing, and that how they function and how they work is a reminder of impermanence, the fact that that change is the essence of our life. I think dementia becomes another gateway into the essence of who we are. It can become an experience that obviously can be very fearful and create anxiety. And at the same time, it can become an experience that opens us to the fact that life is impermanent and what is important. Who is it that we love? What do we care about? What do we want to do in life? Who are we? What is the essential nature of who we are? And I think that's part of the link to it, is that it becomes another opportunity to recognize that there is a grief there is a loss, and it's a loss that's happening on a regular basis. And yet most of us, all of us, I think, go through life experiencing grief, but also go through life disconnecting from it. We have become really, really good at both kind of anesthetizing ourselves. These are kind of words of Francis Weller's, but we engage in the doing, the busyness of life. We engage in addictions. We engage in binge watching stuff to stay out of our bodies, to not experience what we're feeling in our bodies. And the other is that in some ways we disconnect from the fact that we're going to die, that it is something that is an experience we're all going to have. So I think, again, the essence of going through and experiencing dementia is that it's a type of loss. It's another experience that can open us to kind of the nature of what life is all about.
Yeah. And I think you kind of touched on this. Let's elaborate a little more on something that I think is going to be really important to everybody. And that is, how can we cultivate and work with grief to lead a more full life? And I think you kind of touched on that a little bit when you talked about having a new outlook on things, looking at situations differently, a new appreciation for things. But can you kind of elaborate on that, John?
I think the starting point is that we have to become aware of grief, the nature of the fact that it is the essence of our life. And then once we're aware that grief is an experience that we all share, how do we then cultivate it? And I think we cultivate it both privately and publicly. So privately, we can cultivate grief in our meditation, in our ways of our dreams. A lot of times grief emerges in dreams, and so we can become aware of what emerges in our dreams. We can do writing and keep journals. There's a variety of sort of different activities that can keep us attuned to our grief. Publicly, I think we need to share. We need to be able, in a safe way, to trust and talk about what our experiences are in life. And in doing so, we then realize that our grief is connected to each other, that we all are sharing in this loss. We may have different losses and we may experience them in different ways, but coming together in groups and sharing our experiences, developing rituals that again, I don't think are a lot of our culture, but yet are becoming very important, where we can come together and share a meal. And, and again, it may be that developing, artwork. So those are some things that can be, cultivated.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us today to share the information about grief and dementia and the relationship there, and helping us all to be a little more educated about the different sides of grief, John.
Sure.
I'd like to thank you for joining DAA for this Professional Insights podcast. Please visit our website, daanow.org, to view other podcasts, find valuable resources, and find ways to connect with other people living with dementia through our virtual discussion and engagement groups. Dementia Action Alliance is committed to enhancing lives, connecting people, and increasing understanding. And again, thank you very much, John.
Live our life to the fullest we can.